A family seals their door with plaster and rope. Inside, their bodies lie pale, with two quiet wounds at the throat. On the threshold rests a broken shard of clay. Scratched into its surface are the words, "I lit no lamps for 3 nights, for I feared the wanderer would knock." Who or what was the wanderer? They say the night has always been watching us. Long before the first walls rose from dust, before men carved years into stone, whispers drifted from fire to fire, of the shapes at the door that never knocked, of breaths stolen in the dark, of the dead who refused to rest. Faces changed, names changed, but the hunger, it never did. Welcome to Arcane Echoes. I'm your host, Jessica. Tonight, we follow that hunger across centuries, through deserts and rivers, marble courts and bamboo groves, frostbound fields where church bells toll and fall silent. We will see how the oldest shadows learn to wear the faces of gods, demons, and monsters. And perhaps we will see how they never left us at all. The first names for these hungers were etched in clay, as old as civilization itself, and they began in Mesopotamia. Imagine the air thick with clay dust, the sweet rot of figs ripening in baskets, the shuffle of sandals on sun-baked streets. By day, Ur, Uruk, and Babylon thrived. Merchants cried out their wares. Barley and oil passed from hand to hand. Temple flutes sang above rivers that glittered like veins of silver. But at night, when sun slid behind ziggurats, shadows did not fade gently. They poured in like black water, flooding alleys and courtyards, and within those shadows, the world's earliest stories of vampiric beings were born, carved into clay tablets as early as 2100 BCE. The Mesopotamians believed that every soul was destined for Urkala, the underworld ruled by Erishkigal. But for those denied the rites of burial, the drowned, the murdered, the forgotten, there was no peace. They became something else, the Etuku and the Edimu, hungry spirits pressing against the living. It was said they crept into houses on silent feet, pinning sleepers beneath an invisible weight until breath left their lungs. The Maklu tablets preserved the desperate spells of protection. Cedar, sulfur, and water drawn from the river, charms meant to drive the spirits back into the dark. One tale from Lagash speaks of a soldier who drowned in the Tigris before he could be buried. His brother woke each night choking, a heavy pressure pressing on his chest. Each dawn he grew weaker, lips cracked and skin brittle, until on the seventh morning he did not rise. Bread and beer were carried to the crossroads in appeasement, offerings to a thirst no family could satisfy. Some whispered that such spirits did not only suffocate their victims, they knocked. Once, twice, and if you heard the third, you would never wake again. Other beings haunted the night as well. Among the most enduring were the Lilu and Lilitu, male and female demons who slipped through windows with hair black as pitch and eyes glittering like stars. They lingered at cradles, feeding on infants, while mothers inscribed protective spells around clay bowls. May Lilitu not enter, may she not drink, may she not take the child. Yet the Lilitu were not bound to cradles. They were seductresses, draining men in dreams until they withered. A priestess once recorded the fate of a man visited by the maiden in the dark, whose strength ebbed away until only dust remained. Still, others came as whispers. The Ekemu were restless shades who did not feed in gulps but in threads, stealing life with soft breath at the ear. Sometimes they were only silence itself, an absence in the air that pressed too close. A story from Ashur tells of a woman who refused offerings for her drowned husband. At night, she heard her name whispered by unseen lips. Each morning, she woke weaker, until one dawn she was found lifeless by the hearth. Only when food was placed at his watery grave did the whispers stop. But no figure inspired more terror than Lamastu, the lion-headed, talon-fingered demoness who preyed upon pregnant women and newborns. She drank blood, devoured flesh, and left households trembling in her wake. To guard against her, amulets were carved with the face of Pazuzu, the god who alone could restrain her. Without his protection, mothers risked waking to find their child pale and breathless, as if the very air had been stolen from their lungs. And then there was the Wanderer. The fragment of a clay shard found at Sippar speaks of him still. A merchant returned after 40 days to find his house sealed in plaster and rope. Inside, his family lay pale, each throat marked with 2 small wounds. On a broken piece of clay at the threshold, he reads the words, "I lit no lamps for 3 nights, for I feared the Wanderer would knock." The Wanderer appears again and again in Mesopotamian exorcism texts, a shadow that drifts from door to door, never asking, never waiting. Once he calls your name, the light itself betrays you. Here, hunger rose from neglect, from the unburied, the forgotten, the wronged. But along the Nile, hunger could be divine, loosed not from graves, but from the gods themselves. Follow the Nile south, where the river winds like a green serpent through the red desert. Here, life was a bargain. The river gave abundance, but it could also take. To the Egyptians, death was not an ending, but a passage. The weighing of the heart against Ma'at's feather, tombs stocked with bread and beer, and spells to guide the soul. Yet even in this land of order, there were hungers that crept between temples and tombs, hungers that fed not on offerings, but on the living. They told of Sekhmet, the lion-headed daughter of Ra, unleashed when his wrath overflowed. Her roar thundered across the dunes as her claws ran red. Whole villages scattered before her, only to be cut down. The gods themselves feared she would wipe out all of humanity, so they brewed thousands of jars of beer stained with ochre until it gleamed like blood. They poured it into channels carved through the sand. Sekhmet drank deep, thinking it flesh, until her frenzy faltered and she collapsed into sleep. But the story is a warning that if ever Ra's patience broke again, Sekhmet would rise and her thirst would return unquenched. Not all predators were divine. The Egyptians feared the Mut, ancestors who rose when offerings were neglected. Families kept shrines with bread, milk, and incense to keep the dead content, for if they hungered, they came back. One tale from Thebes tells of a noble who ignored his family's shrine. Servants collapsed one by one, their lips pale, their bodies waxy. On the 7th day, the noble himself was found in bed, eyes fixed, and throat marked with 2 punctures, high on the collarbone. Priests declared that it was his father's spirit, denied what was owed, that had returned to feed. There was also a Mut, the devourer, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, who crouched beside the scales of judgment, waiting to swallow the hearts of the unworthy. But whispers told of nights when a Mut strayed from the underworld, prowling dreams. Victims woke with the taste of iron on their tongues, bruises blooming across their chests in the shape of jaws. Even the pyramid texts speak of an eater of shadows, who crossed from Duat into the land of the living, leaving fear in her wake. The Nile itself bred its own revenants. Fishermen spoke of pale figures rising among the reeds, hair tangled with weeds, eyes blind, and mouths forever moving with water they could not swallow. These river haunts came by night, knocking on doors, calling in voices too familiar to rest. One fisherman's wife swore her drowned husband knocked at her door, calling her name. She opened it, though the threshold was empty. Days later, her body was found among the reeds, lips blue, chest hollowed, as though the river had breathed her dry. Archaeologists have uncovered clay amulets laid along riverbanks, inscribed with prayers. May the mouth of the drowned be sealed. May their hunger return to the waters. And at Karnak, the priests told of an apprentice found slumped against the temple limestone at dawn. His lips were blue, his skin drained of color, his neck marked by 2 wounds, no wider than a jeweler's tool. They refused to bury him in the necropolis, Fearing the earth could not hold him. Instead, they burned his body upon a pile of acacia and cast his ashes into the Nile, not as punishment, but as protection, to keep his hunger from spreading among the living. Here, hunger was not the only curse of the forgotten, but a weapon wielded by gods, spirits, and even the river itself. And as we leave the Nile behind, the shadows shift again. In Greece, hunger learned to wear a beautiful face. The Greeks believed death was a crossing, not an end. Coins were placed beneath the tongue to pay Charon, the ferryman of the Styx. But not every soul stayed across the waters. Some slipped back, cloaked in beauty or horror, their hunger sharper than any blade. To the Greeks, the vampire was rarely a beast. It was a lure itself. Queens and maidens, mothers and mistresses. A reminder that beauty, unchecked, could devour as surely as the grave. They whispered of Lamia, once a Libyan queen, beloved by Zeus. Hera, jealous of her rival, slaughtered Lamia's children. Driven to madness by grief, she transformed into something neither mortal nor divine, a predator of children whose hunger soon extended to handsome young men. Diodorus Siculus records tales of her wandering by moonlight, luring lovers who never returned. Later, stories claimed she could remove her eyes at night, setting them in a jar before stalking victims half blind, guided by scent and thirst alone. In Thessaly, they told of Arion, a youth who vanished after meeting a dark-haired woman at a spring. Days later, his body was found, pale as marble, two faint wounds at his neck. Villagers swore they saw her shadow by the water, eyes glowing like embers in the dark. And Lamia was not alone. The Impusei, daughters of Hecate, came striding from the night. Shapeshifters, they appeared as dazzling maidens with hair like fire, though their legs betrayed them, one of brass and the other a mule's. They seduced travelers and drained them dry, corpses left pale and empty on the roadside. Philostratus tells of an Impusa who bewitched the youth Menippus, but was unmasked at a feast by Apollonius, revealed as nothing but a blood-drinking phantom. The warning was clear. Desire itself could mask death. Not too far away, merchants told of a man who dreamed of a woman smiling above him, eyes glowing like coals. He awoke paralyzed, his throat sore, his breath shallow. By the third night, he was dead, lips blackened as though scorched by smoke. Children, too, were not spared. In Athens, mothers frightened them into obedience with tales of the Mormo, spirits who fed on disobedient children. Horace mentions them as boogie women, but inscriptions in Corinth tell of something darker, infants found lifeless in their cradles, cold, their tiny throats marked with teeth. Mormo was more than a tale to hush children. She became the only answer for grief too great to bear. On the island of Euboea, they told of a widow whose drowned son returned 3 nights after his death. He knocked on her door, smiling, dripping salt water. She let him in. By morning, she was dead, her throat pierced. Villagers later swore they saw a pale woman walking the shoreline that night, leaving no prints in the sand. Some said he had not returned at all, but that a sea spirit had worn his face. And still the skies brought fear. The Strigas were women with talons and wings, scraping claws across rooftops until parents ventured outside, only to be carried into the night. Roman writers would later call them the witches who turned into owls to drink infants' blood. The Greek villagers already spoke of wings whispering against shutters, of cradles found empty. One mother on Lesbos lit a lamp to find her child gone, the blanket damp, scented faintly of honey. Days later, fishermen claimed they saw a shadow glide across the moon, a woman's shape, arms outstretched, fingers hooked like claws. In the mountains of Arcadia, the tales grew stranger still. They spoke of women who could peel away their skin like snakes, stepping forth as radiant maidens, their eyes cold and predatory. One shepherd claimed a figure came to his window with a lantern, calling his name 3 times. When he refused to answer, she pressed her hand against the glass, and he watched her flesh slough from her arm, revealing sinew and pale muscle beneath. He fled into the night and never returned to his home. For the Greeks, vampires were not beasts lurking in caves. They were beauty with fangs, warnings wrapped in allure. Lamia embodied grief that soured into hunger. The Impuse revealed lust as a path to death. The Mormo kept children in line through fear. The Strigas and skin shutters reminded villagers that night itself could wear a beautiful mask. These were lessons carved in marble and whispered by firelight. That desire, unchecked, was as dangerous as any grave. And so the hunger spread eastward still. In China, it would not wear beauty, but rigidity. Corpses stiffened, arms outstretched, and the dead learned to hop. Eastward, the air grows heavy with mist and incense, the smell of pine and river water thick on the wind. Bamboo groves whisper in the dark, and in the mountain passes, fog curls low over villages where tiled roofs glisten like scales at dawn. Here, the boundary between the living and the dead was thought to be fragile. Funeral rites were not mere customs, they were seals. To neglect them was to invite horror. The most feared revenant was the jingshi, the stiff, hopping corpse, skin bruised green-black, eyes clouded like frosted glass, arms stretched before it. It did not thirst for blood, but for chi, the vital breath of life. Victims were found brittle, like parchment left to dry in the sun. Improper burials, violent deaths, or failures in ritual could awaken such a thing. Taoist priests warned of corpses transported long distances without rites, for they might reanimate. As early as the Han, funerary warnings carried the fear, though the Qing dynasty gave it its name. A story from Shaanxi tells of a farmer who woke choking beneath crushing weight, icy air flooding his lungs. By morning, his hair had gone gray. 3 days later, he was dead, his eyes open and white. Villagers whispered that the midnight hopper had stolen his breath. To fight these creatures, Taoist priests burned talismans scrawled in cinnabar ink, chanted scriptures, and struck the corpses with peachwood swords. If such measures failed, the living bound the body in red thread or nailed its skull to keep it still. But not all those who rose did so from broken rights. Some returned bound by rage. Villages feared the woman in red, betrayed brides, murdered wives, shamed women who met early graves. Pale faces framed by crimson wedding robes, lips blackened with the blood of their victims. They haunted their betrayers. Folklore said to die in red was to promise vengeance. Along the Yangtze, they told of a groom found pale in the courtyard on his wedding night, eyes wide, lips drained, his bride dreaming of a red-robed woman pressing a cold hand over her face. In Guangdong, they warned of a mistress who hanged herself in scarlet silk. Her spirit followed her lover for months, watching him from mirrors, until he was found bloodless, a crimson handprint across his throat. Even the land itself harbored hungers. Beneath the broad leaves of banana trees, the dead were said to whisper. They called in the voices of loved ones, luring the living outside. In Fujian, a man swore he heard his sister calling during a storm. At dawn, he was found beneath the tree, his throat ringed and red, as though clutched by invisible hands. Families planted banana trees far from their homes, fearful that women who died in childbirth lingered beneath them, waiting to call their husbands, their siblings, their children into death. And still the night carries lures. Travelers whispered of the Jingnu, the bird woman. With the face of the woman and the beak of a predator, she cried like an infant from river reeds. Soldiers returned from war spoke of hearing her cries. One followed the sound and was found collapsed by the roadside, skin clammy, a thick trickle of blood staining under his shoulder. Underlying these terrors was the oldest fear of all, the hungry ghost. In Buddhist belief, those who lived selfish, greedy lives were reborn cursed. Swollen stomachs, throats like pinholes, thirst without end. They wandered the earth feeding on ashes, corpses, or the very life of the living. The Ghost Festival, held on the 15th day of the 7th lunar month, was meant to placate them. Families left food, poured wine, burned paper money, lest the hungry dead invade their homes. Yet some ghosts could never be appeased. One Qing dynasty tale tells of a scholar who mocked the festival. Within weeks, he wasted away to skin and bone, lips cracked and parched. Neighbors swore they saw a pale figure crouched at his bedside, its mouth pressed to its chest, drinking his breath. From the hopping corpses of the Jingxi to betrayed brides in scarlet, from the whispering banana trees to the cries of the bird woman, Chinese tradition saw vampirism not only as a thirst for blood, but as a theft of vitality, of fate itself. To the living, these stories were warnings. Honor the dead, respect the rights, and never open the door to voices that call in the night. For in China, the greatest terror was not death itself, but the breathless state between life and death, when hunger lingers and the body refuses to stay still. And westward, across frost-bound fields, hunger would grow colder still. In Europe, the dead learned not only to whisper or to knock, but to chew. Westward, the hunger spread into lands of frost and shadow. Villages huddled beneath church towers, each bell tolling like a ward against the night. Yet the graveyards at their feet were not always still. Winter froze the ground too hard to dig, and corpses were often laid in shallow earth. On cold nights, villagers swore they heard muffled gnawing from beneath the soil, a wet, steady chewing that carried on the wind. When the graves were opened, bodies were found turned on their sides, shrouds half-eaten, mouths stained dark. These were the shroud eaters. In German lands, they called them the Nachtsterer, corpses that consumed their own burial cloths, and in doing so, drained the life from the kin still living. Records from 17th century Silesia tell of whole families fading mysteriously, their deaths blamed on one corpse chewing in silence underground. To stop them, villagers forced stones or bricks into the mouths of the dead, bound jaws with iron, even laid sickles across the throats so that if the corpses tried to rise, it would cut off its own head. From there, the terror spread south into Serbia. In the village of Medoigna lived Arnold Paole, a soldier who claimed he had once been attacked by a vampire in Greece. He swore he had cured himself by eating earth from the creature's grave and smearing himself with its blood. But when Paole died in 1725 after a fall, whispers began. Villagers said he walked again. 17 people died in the weeks that followed, their bodies wasted, their skin drained. When his grave was opened, his corpse was whole, his lips red with blood. They staked him, burned him, scattered his ashes, but fear only grew. Reports spread of animals turning vampiric, of others rising. Austrian military doctors came to investigate, their records fueling a hysteria that swept through Europe. In Poland, the river carried its own revenants. They spoke of a miller's daughter drowned in spring floods. Weeks later, children began to vanish. Some swore they saw her by the riverbank, cheeks flushed, lips dark, hair dripping. When her grave was opened, her body looked alive, her lips still red. They burned her, and the disappearances ceased. She was remembered as one of the Uper, the restless dead, who rose from the improper burial. In Italy, another fear stirred. The Benedanti of Friuli told inquisitors their spirits left their bodies at night to fight witches and vampires in dreamlike battles. Armed with fennel stalks, they claimed to face enemies who wielded sorghum sticks, foes who fed on infants, and even the unborn. The Inquisition dismissed them as heretics or madmen, but their visions revealed how deeply vampiric dread intertwined with fertility, harvest, and the fragile cycle of life itself. And in England, plague carried its own revenants. When the Black Death swelled mass graves, corpses were said to claw their way to the surface. Chroniclers told of bloated bodies walking the countryside, spreading terror until priests laid them back into the earth. These revenants did not bite. Their presence alone seemed to blight households, their shadows pacing outside windows at night. Excavations in London have uncovered plague victims with bricks forced into their mouths, mute testimony to the belief that even in death, the dead could chew their way into the living world. But it was in the Carpathians that the stories turned darkest. There, they spoke of the Nosferatu, tall, gaunt, their nails curved like sickles, their eyes glinting without blink or rest. Unlike revenants, they did not simply haunt, they infected. Those bitten did not remain in their graves. They rose, thirsting endlessly, creating more of their kind. In one monastery, monks died one by one, each found pale, lips red. The last was discovered kneeling before the altar, his throat torn open, his face radiant with rapture, as though he had glimpsed something holy or something older still. The very name Nosferatu, drawn from the Romanian Nesuferit, the insufferable one, came to embody not only death, but contagion, famine, and plague itself. From Shroud Eaters to Arnold Paoli's Contagion, to Poland's Drowned Maidens, Italy's Dream Warriors, England's Plague Revenants, and the Nosferatu of Transylvania, Europe's vampire lore was vast, terrible, and diverse. Shaped by famine, war, and winter, it grew from shallow graves, from the Black Death's mass pits, from fears of disease that spread like fire. The vampire here was never just a predator. It was a mirror, a reminder that hunger and death walked beside them in every season of cold. From Mesopotamia's dusty ziggurats to Egypt's painted tombs, from Greece's marble courts to China's misted valleys, from Europe's frozen graveyards to the black pines of Transylvania. The names have shifted, the faces have changed, but the hunger, it has never left us. Perhaps it was never meant to. They say the night has always been watching us, and now it knows your name. So if you hear knocking tonight, no matter how familiar the voice, no matter how gentle the call, do not answer. What we've explored tonight is only the beginning. Vampires did not end with clay shards and plague pits. Their stories moved forward, adapting, surviving, reshaping themselves with every century. They found new homes in castles, in whispers of disease, in literature, and eventually in the flicker of cinema screens. The hunger endured, and it still endures. There are more stories waiting, more shadows yet to knock. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the origins of vampire legend, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Arcane Echoes, and share it with a friend who loves the strange and macabre. Because the shadows are always hungry, and they're always waiting for the next chapter.